The town had no name on any map by the spring of 1888, and those who lived there preferred it that way. What remained unspoken in the saloons and along the wooden boardwalks was this: no law had crossed into the valley for more than 3 years, no federal marshal, no territorial judge. Not even a circuit preacher willing to speak against the men who walked freely down the center of the street at noon, with iron on their hips and blood on their ledgers. Something had happened here that made decent people look at their boots when strangers asked questions. Something that turned a Colorado mining settlement into a place where right and wrong had ceased to mean anything at all. And in the spring of that year, a man arrived who would finally ask why. The stagecoach that brought him rattled into town just after dawn, when the light was still gray and uncertain. He stepped down onto the hardpack with a leather satchel and a worn coat that had seen better years. His name was Daniel Carew, and he carried himself with the quiet economy of someone who had learned long ago not to draw attention. He was 42 years old, though the lines around his eyes made him appear older. He had been a lawyer once in Denver, before the bottle and a series of poor choices had stripped that life away. Now he was something else. A claims adjuster for a mining concern back east, sent to investigate why their quarterly reports had stopped arriving from a supposedly profitable operation in the Western Range. The town sat in a narrow valley, flanked by pine-covered slopes that rose sharply on both sides. A single dirt road ran through its center, lined with false-fronted buildings that leaned slightly, as if weary from standing. There was a mercantile, a stable, a smithy, 2 saloons facing each other like rivals, and a building that might once have been a land office but now stood shuttered. No church, no schoolhouse. Carew counted perhaps 24 structures in all and smoke rising from only half of them. He took a room above the smaller of the 2 saloons, a place called the Tin Star, though no star hung anywhere on its weathered facade. The woman who took his coin was perhaps 30, with auburn hair pinned back and eyes that assessed him without warmth. She said her name was Judith, and that meals came with the room if he wanted them. Her voice carried the flat tone of someone who had grown tired of questions. Carew asked where he might find the supervisor of the Carver mine. Judith paused in the act of turning away. For just a moment, something flickered across her face, quick as a moth. Then it was gone. "You'll want to speak with Mr. Hale," she said. "He'll find you," she said, and left him standing at the top of the narrow stairs. That first day, Carew walked the length of the town. He passed men who did not greet him, who watched from doorways and from beneath the brims of their hats, with the wary stillness of animals that know a territory is claimed. The mercantile was dimly lit and sparsely stocked. The proprietor, an older man with a limp, took Carew's money for tobacco, but offered nothing in the way of conversation. At the stable, a boy of perhaps 16 tended to the horses with a nervousness that seemed ingrained, his eyes darting toward the street every few moments as though expecting something. Carew asked the boy if he knew where the mine entrance was located. The boy swallowed and returned to his work without answering. What struck Carew most was the silence. Not the absence of sound. There were sounds enough, the creak of wood, the shuffle of boots, the occasional whinny of a horse, but the absence of voices, no laughter from the saloons, no arguments, no greetings called across the street. It was as though the entire town held its breath. That evening, he sat in the Tin Star nursing a whiskey that tasted like burnt grain. 3 other men occupied the room, seated separately, each nursing their own drink in silence. Judith moved behind the bar with mechanical efficiency. A lamp with a cracked chimney cast uneven light across tables scarred with years of use. The door opened, and 2 men entered. The change in the room was immediate. The 3 drinkers straightened slightly, their shoulders tensing. Judith's hands stilled on the glass she had been wiping. Even the air seemed to thicken. The first man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat and a flat-brimmed hat. His boots were good quality, polished despite the dust of the street. He wore a revolver on his right hip, tied low. His face was handsome in a hard way, with a neat mustache and eyes the color of river ice. He moved with the assurance of someone who had never been told no. The second man was shorter, wiry, with a patchy beard and a nervous energy that expressed itself in the constant movement of his hands. "I'm William Hale." Hale crossed the room and sat down at Corot's table without invitation. The shorter man remained standing by the door, his hands now still, resting near his belt. Corot explained his position, his employer, the irregularity of the reports. He kept his voice even and professional, the way he once had in courtrooms. 3 months without correspondence suggests either a problem with production or a problem with communication. "I'd like to inspect the mine." Authority's a strange word to use in a place like this. Hale stood, smoothing his coat. "You rest up tonight." He left before Corot could respond, the shorter man following like a shadow. Her hands paused. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "He's the man who makes decisions." But she turned away, disappearing into the back room, and Corot was left alone with his whiskey and the growing certainty that he had walked into something far more complicated than a simple audit. That night, lying on a thin mattress in a room that smelled of old smoke, he heard voices from somewhere below, not from the saloon, that had emptied and gone quiet an hour past sundown, but from outside in the street. Low voices, men talking in tones too hushed to make out words. Then the sound of horses, several of them, moving slowly through town. He rose and moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtain. 5 riders passed below, shapes in the darkness. They moved without hurry, heading east toward the canyon. One of them laughed, the sound sudden and jarring in the stillness, and then they were gone, swallowed by the night. Corot returned to his bed but did not sleep for a long time. The next day brought no visit from Hale, no guide to the mine. Corot spent the morning walking the perimeter of the town, sketching a rough map in a notebook he carried. He noted the positions of buildings, the lay of the land, the single road in and out. At the eastern edge, where the buildings gave way to scrub and pine, he found evidence of recent travel, wheel ruts, hoof prints, the remains of a camp where someone had built a fire and left the stones scattered. He spoke to no one, and no one spoke to him. In the afternoon, he returned to the mercantile. The proprietor was arranging cans on a shelf with the concentration of a man trying to appear occupied. Corot browsed for a few moments, then approached the counter. "How long have you lived here?" he asked. The man did not look at him. The proprietor's hands stilled. He turned slowly, and for the first time Corot saw something in his face. Not anger, not fear exactly, but a kind of exhausted resignation. "Mister," he said quietly, "I'm going to give you some advice, and you can take it or leave it as you see fit. You came here with questions, and that's your business. But there are questions that get answered and questions that get a man hurt. You seem like a decent sort." The proprietor studied him for a long moment. Then he glanced toward the window, toward the street beyond, and when he spoke again his voice was barely above a whisper. 3 years ago, this town had a sheriff, had a mayor too, after a fashion, had people who'd come here thinking they'd build something. Then the Hale brothers arrived. William and his younger brother Thomas. They came with 7 men, maybe 8, said they were investors, said they'd bought shares in the mine and wanted to see it prosper. Within a month, the sheriff was gone, just rode out one day and never came back. The mayor tried to organize a council, tried to stand up to them when they started taking more than their share. They found him in the canyon with his neck broken, ruled it an accident. After that, people stopped organizing, stopped resisting. The Hales and their men, they don't just run the mine. Who'd believe it, and who'd go for help? The nearest marshal's office is 3 days' ride. The question seemed to strike something deep. The proprietor looked away, his jaw working. Before Corot could respond, the door opened. The shorter man from the previous night stepped inside, his eyes moving from Corot to the proprietor and back again. He said nothing, but his presence was message enough. Corot thanked the proprietor for his time and left. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the western ridge and the valley filled with shadow, he sat again in the Tin Star. Judith brought him a plate of beans and cornbread without asking. The food was simple but prepared with care. He ate slowly, thinking through what he had learned, what he suspected, what he could prove. The door opened. This time it was a different man, younger, perhaps 25, with dark hair and a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. "Name's Moss. I work for Mr." After he left, Corot sat for a while longer, watching the shadows deepen in the corners of the room. Judith moved behind the bar, her face unreadable in the dim light. For a long time, she did not answer. Then she set down the glass she was holding and came to sit across from him. Up close he could see the weariness in her eyes, the fine lines that spoke of worry and sleepless nights. "I had a husband," she said quietly. "He worked the mine. Good man, honest. When the Hales came, he was one of the ones who spoke against them, said it wasn't right, what they were doing." "No," her voice was flat. "They made him part of it, gave him a choice, work for them, do what they said, or they'd burn this place down with me inside it. So he did. He became one of them." Corot felt the weight of her words settle over him like a shroud. "I stayed because leaving felt like admitting he died for nothing," she continued. "And because maybe, somewhere deep down, I kept hoping someone would come who could change things. But men like you, Mr. Corot, men with papers and authority from back east, they don't change anything out here." She rose and returned to the bar, leaving him alone with his thoughts in the growing dark. That night, Corot did not hear voices or horses. The town was silent as a grave. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about sheriffs who rode away and mayors who fell from cliffs and husbands who chose bullets over compromise. He thought about the men he had seen, the way they moved through the town like wolves through a fold. And he thought about the mine, hidden up in the canyon, and what he might find there when the sun rose. He thought about turning back, about writing a report that said operations were satisfactory and catching the next stage out. About returning to Denver and finding another bottle and forgetting he had ever heard the name of this nameless town. But he knew he would not. Something in him, some stubborn, self-destructive remnant of the man he had been before the law, and the drink had broken him, would not allow it. He rose before dawn and dressed in the darkness. He checked the derringer he kept in his coat pocket, a small weapon he had carried for years and never fired. Then he went downstairs and out into the cold morning air. The street was empty, the buildings silent. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, a lonely sound that faded quickly. Corot walked toward the stable, his breath misting in the chill. Moss was waiting with 2 horses already saddled. He nodded to Corot without speaking and swung up onto his mount. Corot did the same, and together they rode east, toward the mouth of the canyon where the darkness still pooled thick, and the first light had not yet reached. They rode in silence for the better part of an hour, the trail climbing steadily through pine and scrub. The air grew thinner, colder. The horses' hooves clattered on stone, and somewhere a creek rushed unseen through the trees. Moss did not look back, did not speak, simply rode with the easy posture of someone who knew the path by heart. As the sun finally broke over the ridge, spilling gold across the slopes, Corot saw the mine. It was larger than he had expected, a series of timber structures built into the hillside, rough-hewn and functional. A head frame rose above the main shaft, and rail tracks emerged from the darkness of the entrance, leading to a sorting area where ore carts sat idle. Smoke rose from a chimney, a bunkhouse perhaps, or a forge, and around it all like sentries stood men with rifles. Moss reined in at the edge of the compound. 5 men watched their approach, their faces hard and unreadable. None of them moved to greet them. "Wait here," Moss said, and rode forward alone. Corot sat his horse, feeling the weight of eyes upon him. The sun was warm on his back, but the air still carried the night's chill. He counted 8 men in total now, and he suspected there were more inside the buildings. This was not a mining operation. It was a fortress. Moss returned after a brief conversation with one of the riflemen. "Mr. Hale's not here today." Corot studied the younger man's face, looking for something. Uncertainty, sympathy, anything human. He found nothing. For a moment, they faced each other in the growing light. Corot felt the derringer in his pocket, small and useless against 8 rifles. He felt the futility of his authority, his papers, his purpose. And beneath it all, he felt the cold certainty that something was deeply, irrevocably wrong in this place. "All right," he said quietly. But as he turned his horse, as he began the long ride down the canyon, he heard something that made his blood run cold. From somewhere deep within the mine, muffled by earth and timber, came a sound. It might have been the clatter of machinery. Corot rode back alone, the sound from the mine shaft following him like a ghost. By the time he reached the valley floor, the morning had fully arrived, and the nameless town sat quiet in its embrace. He stabled his horse and walked to the Tin Star without seeing anyone, though he felt eyes tracking him from windows and doorways. Inside his room, he sat on the edge of the bed and tried to make sense of what little he knew. A mining operation that required armed guards, a foreman who controlled access with the casual authority of a general, a town held in suspension, waiting for something that might never come. And that sound, echoing up from the earth. He spent the afternoon writing a letter to his employer in Philadelphia, choosing his words with care. He described the irregularities, the lack of cooperation, the atmosphere of intimidation. He stopped short of making accusations he could not yet prove. When he finished, he sealed the envelope and carried it to the mercantile, asking the proprietor where outgoing mail could be posted. The older man looked at the envelope as though it might bite him. "Stage comes through every 8 days, left 3 days ago." Corot returned to his room and hid the letter between the pages of a book he carried. 5 days. He could survive 5 days. But that evening, as he descended to the saloon for supper, he found William Hale waiting at his usual table. The tall man sat with his back to the wall, a glass of amber liquid before him. He gestured to the chair opposite. "I'm not a claim jumper. I don't need control." Hale leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Corot, let me speak plainly. You arrived here with certain expectations. You expected cooperation, transparency, the usual courtesies. But this isn't Philadelphia. This is hard country, and it breeds hard men. The mine operates because I make it operate. The town functions because I maintain order. It explains everything if you're willing to hear it." Hale finished his drink and stood. He left before Corot could respond. The room seemed to breathe easier in his absence, though the threat of his words hung in the air like smoke. 3 days. Corot could wait 3 days. But in the meantime, he would not be idle. The next morning, he walked to the eastern edge of town where the canyon road began its climb. A handful of buildings stood here, including what appeared to be an abandoned assay office. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, dust covered everything. A desk, scattered papers, broken glass from a window that had been shattered and never repaired. Corot rifled through the papers carefully. Most were invoices and receipts from 3 years prior, before the Hales had arrived. He found a ledger that documented ore samples and their mineral content. The numbers showed modest but consistent yields of silver and trace amounts of gold. Nothing extraordinary, but enough to justify continued operation. Then, tucked beneath a broken drawer, he found something else. A journal, small and bound in leather, its pages water-stained but readable. The handwriting was cramped and hurried. He opened it to the first entry, dated April 1885. The words described the arrival of 2 brothers from Nevada, investors who promised capital and expansion. The writer, whose name appeared nowhere in the journal, expressed cautious optimism. The mine had struggled in recent months, and new money could mean the difference between survival and abandonment. Corot turned pages, reading entries that chronicled the first weeks. The Hales had been generous initially, paying workers on time, funding improvements to equipment. But within a month, the tone began to shift. References appeared to new rules, restrictions on where miners could work. Sections of the operation declared off-limits without explanation. The entries grew more disturbed. Men were disappearing from the workforce. Some said they had moved on to other prospects, but their belongings remained in the bunkhouse. The writer described confronting William Hale about the discrepancies and being told to mind his own affairs. After that, blank pages. Corot closed the journal and slipped it into his coat. He left the assay office and walked slowly back toward the center of town, his mind working through possibilities. A mine could hide many things: unsafe practices, poor yields, even theft of resources. But men did not guard such secrets with rifles. Men did not create prisons of silence for mere financial impropriety. Whatever the Carver mine had become, it was not simply a business venture gone wrong. That afternoon, he sought out the boy at the stable, finding him mucking stalls. The youth looked up nervously as Corot approached. "I want to ask you something," Corot said quietly. "They're not allowed, mister. Food, water barrels. Heavy ones like for securing loads, but lots of them." He looked directly at Corot for the first time, and there was fear in his eyes. "Sir, you should leave this place." But the boy turned away, returning to his work, and would not speak again. Corot walked back to the Tin Star as the sun angled toward evening. He passed men on the street who no longer watched him with mere wariness, but with something approaching calculation, as though measuring him for a purpose he could not yet divine. In his room, he laid out what he knew. A mine that once employed workers freely now kept them isolated. Supplies that included restraints, armed guards preventing inspection, a town terrorized into silence, and that sound from the shaft, distant, muffled but unmistakably human. The conclusion formed slowly, terribly in his mind. But it was still incomplete, still lacking the evidence that would make it more than suspicion. He needed to see inside that mine. The second night brought visitors. Corot woke to the sound of his door opening. Two figures stood silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. He sat up slowly, reaching instinctively for the derringer beneath his pillow. "Easy, Mr. Corot." It was Moss's voice, calm and unhurried. "Mr." They escorted him downstairs and out into the street, where 3 horses waited. William Hale sat astride the largest, his face shadowed beneath his hat. They rode north, away from the canyon, toward a section of the valley Corot had not yet explored. After 20 minutes, they came to a house set back from the road, larger than anything else in the settlement. Light burned in the windows. Hale dismounted and gestured for Corot to follow. Inside, the house was furnished with an incongruous elegance. Thick carpets, upholstered chairs, oil paintings on the walls. It belonged in Denver or San Francisco, not in this forgotten valley. Hale poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter and handed one to Corot. "The situation is simple. I run a profitable operation. Your employers receive their share." The change of subject caught Corot off guard. Corot took a sip of the whiskey, buying time. "I made mistakes, lost cases I should have won, started drinking to cope." "No," Hale leaned forward. "You gave up. You traded principle for survival, ambition for comfort. You became smaller. My point is that you and I are not so different. We both do what's necessary. We both recognize that the world doesn't operate according to the rules they teach in law schools or churches. I'm comparing 2 men who survive by being pragmatic." Hale set down his glass. "Here's what I'm offering, Mr. Corot. You write your report. You tell your employers that the mine is operational, that yields are within expected parameters, that any delays in correspondence are due to the remoteness of our location. You do this, and when you leave here in 5 days, you'll leave with an envelope containing $5,000. Then you'll leave in 5 days with nothing. Or you won't leave at all. Hale's tone did not change, but the threat was unmistakable. A practical man, Daniel. You've already lost everything once. Corot sat very still, feeling the weight of the offer, the truth of Hale's assessment. He was a practical man. He had given up. He had traded everything that once mattered for the numbness of survival, but somewhere beneath the years of compromise, something stirred, something stubborn and self-destructive and entirely impractical. I want to see the mine, he said quietly. I want to complete my assignment. Hale's expression did not change, but something cold passed through his eyes. Very well, tomorrow morning I'll take you myself. He stood. But understand this, what you're asking to see comes with a cost. Once you know, you'll have to make a choice. They rode back to town in silence. Corot lay awake until dawn, listening to the town's held breath, knowing that morning would bring him to a threshold he might not survive crossing. When Moss came for him at first light, neither man spoke. They rode up the canyon with Hale leading, the horse's hooves marking time like a clock counting down. The mine looked the same, rough timber structures, idle ore carts, armed men watching. But this time, Hale did not stop at the perimeter. He rode directly to the main shaft and dismounted. Leave your horse, he said. Corot followed him into the darkness. The shaft descended at a gentle angle, reinforced with thick beams. Lanterns hung at intervals, casting pools of yellow light. The air grew cooler and carried a mineral smell mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant. They walked for several minutes, the slope taking them deep into the mountain. Then the shaft opened into a larger chamber and Corot stopped, his breath catching. The chamber was perhaps 50 feet across, carved from living rock, but it was not the space itself that froze him in place. It was what filled it. Men worked here, perhaps 15 or 20 of them, gaunt and filthy, swinging picks at the walls in mechanical rhythm. They wore chains around their ankles, connected to iron rings set into the floor. Some looked up as Hale and Corot entered, their eyes hollow and without hope. Workers. Some are former employees who tried to leave, to tell stories about irregularities they'd witnessed. Some are drifters who had the misfortune of arriving at the wrong time, asking the wrong questions. Some are men sent to us by associates in other territories, men wanted for actual crimes, men whose disappearance no one will question. Hale gestured to the chamber. They extract ore. We process it, sell it, and keep the profits. Your employers receive reports showing modest but acceptable yields. Corot felt bile rising in his throat. For a long moment, Corot stood frozen, his mind racing through possibilities. He could agree, take the money, leave this valley and try to forget. He could refuse and likely die here, his disappearance adding to the town's accumulated silence. Or he could do something else, something desperate and probably futile, but at least true to the man he once was. He reached into his coat as though to retrieve something, his hand closing around the derringer. But before he could draw it, Moss seized his arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced efficiency. The small weapon clattered to the stone floor. Hale picked it up, examining it with mild interest. People have been saying that for 3 years, and yet here we are. Hale nodded to Moss. They dragged him to an iron ring, fitting the chains with methodical indifference. Corot fought, but Moss was stronger and had the advantage of position. The metal closed around his ankles with a sound like a closing door. "I'll work," Hale said. "I'll extract ore. And when you can't work anymore, we'll put you somewhere quiet and tell anyone who asks that you finished your inspection and moved on." He turned to leave, then paused. "I gave you a choice, Mr. Corot." Then he was gone, and Corot was alone in the darkness with the hollow-eyed men, and the sound of picks striking stone. The days blurred together, measured only by the rhythm of work and the irregular arrival of food and water. Corot learned the names of some of the men, learned that one had been a schoolteacher in Montana, another a shopkeeper from Utah, a third a miner who had simply seen too much. They spoke little, conserving energy, their spirits broken by months or years of confinement. But Corot's spirit was not yet broken. He watched the guards' routines, noting when they were most attentive, when they grew lazy. He studied the chamber's layout, the placement of the rings, the weakness of certain beams. And slowly, carefully, he began to work on the chain attached to his ankle, using a sharp piece of ore to file away at a single link during the hours when darkness hid his movements. It took 17 days. 17 days of work and waiting, of pretending cooperation while nurturing the small flame of resistance. On the 18th night, the link finally gave way. He waited until the guard's footsteps receded up the shaft. Then he moved through the darkness, waking the others, showing them what he had done. Some were too exhausted to care. But 5 men agreed to try. 5 men who still had enough strength, enough anger, enough hope to risk everything for the chance of freedom. They rushed the guard when he returned, overwhelming him before he could raise the alarm. Corot took the man's rifle, and together they ascended the shaft, emerging into the pre-dawn darkness. The compound erupted in chaos. Shouts rang out. More gunfire echoed off the canyon walls. But Corot and the freedmen scattered into the pine trees, running down the slope toward the valley, toward the town, toward whatever lay beyond. Only 3 of them made it. Corot heard the others fall behind him, their bodies lost to the darkness. But he kept running, his lungs burning, his legs threatening to collapse, until finally he burst onto the main street of the nameless town just as the sun broke over the ridge. The town woke to the spectacle of a wild-eyed man in chains, shouting about what he had seen, what he had endured. People emerged from buildings, gathering in the street, their faces showing confusion and fear and something else, something like recognition, as though a truth they had long suspected was finally being spoken aloud. But before Corot could say more, before he could organize them into action, horses came thundering from the canyon. Hale and his men arrived in force, 8 riders with rifles drawn. "That man is a thief and a fugitive," Hale called out, his voice carrying over the crowd. For a moment the town stood balanced on a knife's edge. Then Judith stepped forward from the crowd, positioning herself between Corot and the mounted men. "We've been silent too long," she said. Others moved to join her, the proprietor from the mercantile, the boy from the stable, a woman Corot had never spoken to. "No," Judith said simply. What followed was not the gunfight of dime novels, not the dramatic showdown of legend. What followed was something quieter and more powerful. The crowd stood firm, and Hale, faced with the prospect of murdering 24 townspeople in broad daylight, hesitated. And in that hesitation, his authority cracked. Moss was the first to break. The young man dismounted, set down his rifle and walked away. Others followed, one by one, until Hale sat alone astride his horse, facing a town that had finally found its voice. He did not speak. He simply turned and rode north, disappearing into the hills, leaving behind the ruins of his empire. The marshal arrived 3 weeks later, summoned by messages that finally made it through. He came with deputies and federal authority, and they descended into the mine to find 11 men still chained in the darkness, along with evidence of others who had not survived. The investigation that followed uncovered a network of complicity that reached into 3 territories, involving men of supposed respectability who had turned human suffering into profit. The trial, held in the territorial capital, became a sensation. Newspapers carried details that shocked readers across the nation. William Hale was never found. Some said he fled to Mexico, others that he died in the wilderness. His brother Thomas was captured in Nevada and hanged. 4 other men received lengthy prison sentences. But for the nameless town, justice came too late. Most of its residents dispersed, unwilling to remain in a place that carried such weight of memory. The mine was sealed, its shafts filled with rubble and marked with warnings. Within 2 years, the town was abandoned entirely, its buildings left to weather and decay. Corot returned to Denver. He did not restart his law practice. Instead, he spent his remaining years documenting what he had witnessed, writing letters to newspapers and legislators, testifying at trials when called upon. He became a quiet advocate for labor reforms, for inspections and oversight, for the kinds of protections that might prevent another Carver mine from festering in some forgotten valley. He died in 1903, 15 years after that spring morning when he stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but questions and determination. His obituary was brief, noting his work as a claims adjuster and his role in exposing a criminal enterprise. It did not capture the weight of what he had endured, the cost of his choice, or the lives he had helped save by refusing to look away. For decades, the story faded into the kind of local legend that gets told around fires and in saloons. The details blurred and changed with each telling. Some said the mine was haunted. Others claimed Hale had never existed, that the whole thing was an exaggeration. The nameless town became just another ghost settlement in a landscape dotted with them. Then, in the autumn of 2019, a graduate student named Sarah Chen was researching mining practices in the territorial period for her dissertation. Working through archives in Colorado Springs, she came across a letter tucked into a collection of territorial court documents, a letter written on stationery from a Philadelphia investment firm, addressed to a Daniel Corot, dated April 1888. The letter confirmed his assignment to investigate the Carver mine, but more significantly, attached to it was Corot's final report, not the compromised version he had been offered money to write, but the one he had drafted afterward, describing everything he had witnessed. The report had apparently been misfiled decades ago and forgotten. Sarah spent 6 months tracking down every reference she could find. She located Corot's obituary, trial transcripts, newspaper articles. She found census records showing the town's population before and after the Hales' arrival. She even found a map marking the location of the sealed mine, still identifiable on modern surveys. In spring 2020, she organized an archaeological expedition to the site. Using ground-penetrating radar, her team located the original shaft and several chambers. They excavated carefully, documenting everything. Sarah published her findings in a respected historical journal. The article sparked renewed interest in the case, leading to documentaries and books that brought the story back into public consciousness. The site was designated a historical landmark, preserved as a reminder of what can happen when profit outweighs humanity, when communities choose silence over resistance. But what struck Sarah most, as she stood in that underground chamber looking at those chains, was how close the truth had come to remaining buried forever. One misfiled letter, one forgotten report, one man's decision to resist rather than compromise. She thought about all the other valleys, the other mines, the other stories that did not have a Daniel Corot to speak for them, and she committed herself to finding them, to bringing their truths into the light, to ensuring that the silences of the past would not be allowed to echo into the future. The winter that followed the trial was the coldest anyone could remember. Snow came early to the valley, settling over the abandoned buildings like a shroud, erasing the wagon ruts and footprints, making the town look almost peaceful in its silence. By December, only 7 families remained, those too stubborn or too poor to leave, or perhaps too haunted by what they had witnessed to believe they deserved anything better. Judith stayed through that winter, though the Tin Star no longer functioned as a saloon. She lived in her rooms upstairs and took in mending work from the few who remained, her fingers working needle and thread in the lamplight while snow fell past her window. Sometimes people would ask why she did not leave, why she chose to remain in a place that held nothing but difficult memories. She never answered directly, but those who knew her understood. Leaving would have meant abandoning the last physical connection to her husband, to the man he had been before the hails broke him. The town was her penance and her monument both. The proprietor from the mercantile left in November, selling what inventory remained to a freight company from the territorial capital. On his last day, he stood in the empty store looking at the bare shelves, and someone who was there said his face carried an expression of profound relief, as though he had been holding his breath for 3 years and could finally exhale. He moved to Wyoming and opened another store in a town where the law still meant something. He never spoke of the valley again. The boy from the stable, his name was Marcus Webb, though few had bothered to learn it, went to live with an aunt in Denver. Years later, he would become a labor organizer, fighting for mine safety regulations and workers' rights. Those who knew him said he carried an intensity that seemed rooted in something deeper than ideology, a personal understanding of what happened when power went unchecked. He rarely discussed his childhood, but once, near the end of his life, he told an interviewer that he had learned everything important about justice in a nameless town he could no longer find on any map. Daniel Carew spent 6 weeks recovering in Denver after the marshal brought him out of the valley. The chains had left permanent scars around his ankles, and he walked with a slight limp for the rest of his life. The doctors who treated him remarked on his physical condition, but said little about the look in his eyes, the particular hollowness that came from seeing the depths to which men could sink when they believed themselves beyond judgment. His employer, the Philadelphia investment firm, initially threatened legal action, claiming he had exceeded his authority and caused significant financial losses. But when the full scope of the Carver mine operation became public, when newspapers began running accounts of the trial and the testimony of survivors, the firm quietly withdrew its complaints and issued a statement expressing shock and dismay at the criminal enterprise that had operated under their name. They paid Carew what they owed him and then severed all contact, as though his existence reminded them of their own complicity in failing to investigate sooner. Carew used the money to rent a small office on a side street in Denver. He did not hang a shingle advertising legal services, but word spread among certain communities, laborers, immigrants, those whose disputes fell below the notice of established firms. He took cases that interested him, refused payment when clients could not afford it, and spent his evenings writing letters to legislators about the need for oversight, for inspections, for consequences when the powerful preyed upon the powerless. He never married. Those who knew him said he seemed always to be carrying on a conversation with someone not present, weighing decisions against some internal measure that others could not see. He kept a room in a boarding house run by a widow named Catherine Morris, who treated him with a kindness that expected nothing in return. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear him pacing above her room, and she learned not to ask about the nightmares that woke him. In 1892, 4 years after the events at the Carver mine, Carew received an unexpected visitor. He looked up from his desk one afternoon to find Judith standing in his doorway. She wore a traveling cloak and carried a small valise, and her face showed the lines that came from years of worry finally released. "I wanted to see the man who gave us our voices back," she said. They sat in his sparse office while rain drummed against the window, and for an hour they spoke of small things: the weather, Denver's growth, the changes that seemed to be sweeping through the territories. But beneath the pleasantries lay the weight of shared experience, the understanding between people who had stood at the edge of something terrible and chosen not to look away. Before she left, Judith placed an envelope on his desk. Inside was a photograph, creased and faded. "I thought you should have this," she said. Corot kept the photograph on his desk for the remaining years of his life. Visitors would sometimes ask about it, and he would tell them the story, not the dramatic version that newspapers preferred, but the quieter truth about a man who had been given an impossible choice and broken under the weight of it. He told it as a reminder that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite knowing the cost. The freed miners scattered to different territories, carrying their scars into uncertain futures. One returned to his family in Montana and never entered a mine again, spending his remaining years as a carpenter. Another found work on the railroad, though his daughter would later write that he could not bear enclosed spaces and refused to ride in passenger cars, preferring the open air of the freight platforms. A third died within a year, his body simply giving out after the prolonged deprivation and abuse. But 2 of the survivors found their way to Denver, and with Corot's help, they testified before a territorial commission investigating labor practices. Their accounts, delivered in quiet voices that nonetheless carried weight, led to new regulations requiring regular inspections of mining operations and establishing legal recourse for workers facing dangerous conditions. The changes came slowly and were imperfectly enforced, but they represented a shift in how the law regarded those who labored in darkness. William Hale was never found. Reports surfaced periodically. Someone claimed to have seen him in Sonora, another in San Francisco, a third in the Yukon during the gold rush, but none were confirmed. Most likely, he had done what men like him often did when their empires collapsed, reinvented himself somewhere new, chosen a different name, found other opportunities to exploit the gap between law and justice. Some evil did not end dramatically. It simply moved on and started again. His brother Thomas, however, faced judgment. His trial lasted 3 weeks and produced testimony that filled hundreds of pages of court records. The prosecutor, a young attorney named Morrison who had built his case with methodical care, presented evidence of not just the Carver mine, but a network of similar operations across 3 territories. The defense argued that Thomas had been merely following his brother's orders, that he was a victim of manipulation rather than a true architect of the crimes. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on 17 counts. The judge sentenced him to hang, and on a cold morning in January 1889, the sentence was carried out in the yard of the territorial prison. Thomas Hale went to the scaffold in silence, offering no final words, no appeals for forgiveness or understanding. Witnesses said he looked smaller in death than he had in life, as though the weight of his crimes had been the only thing giving him substance. The 4 other men convicted in connection with the mine received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. Most served their full terms in prisons far from the territories where they had committed their crimes. One died of pneumonia in the 3rd year of his imprisonment. The others emerged eventually, broken and aged, disappearing into the anonymity of cities where no one knew their names or what they had done. But justice, Corot learned, was not a clean thing. It did not restore what had been taken. It did not return the dead to their families, or erase the memories of those who had suffered. It was, at best, an accounting, a public acknowledgement that certain actions carried consequences, that society retained some capacity to distinguish between right and wrong, even when that distinction had been temporarily obscured. The families of those who had died in the mine received no compensation beyond condolences. Most had been drifters, men without strong connections, whose disappearances had gone unnoticed or uninvestigated. A few had wives or children, and these received letters from the territorial governor expressing regret and explaining the limitations of the law when it came to providing restitution. The letters were well-intentioned but ultimately hollow, words on paper that could not fill empty chairs at dinner tables or answer children's questions, about why their fathers never came home. In 1895, Corot received a letter from Sarah Chen's great-grandfather, a Chinese laborer who had worked briefly in the valley before the Hale's arrival. The man had heard about the trial and wanted to share his own experience, how he and others had been driven out through intimidation and threats, how they had tried to report what they suspected was happening, but were dismissed by territorial authorities who considered their testimony unreliable. The letter was formal and carefully composed, and between its lines Corot could read the frustration of a man who had seen injustice but lacked the standing to challenge it. Corot wrote back, a long response that acknowledged the failures of a system that valued some voices over others, that extended protection unequally, that too often required tragedy before it would act. He kept copies of both letters, filing them with other documentation he was assembling, a personal archive of the case that he hoped might someday serve as a complete record of what had happened and why. He died on a Sunday morning in May 1903, sitting in his office chair with an open book on his desk. Catherine Morris found him when he failed to come down for breakfast. The book was a collection of essays on legal philosophy, and his reading glasses rested on a page discussing the relationship between written law and moral obligation. Those who knew him thought it fitting that he should die while contemplating such questions, which had occupied so much of his life. His funeral was attended by perhaps 40 people, former clients, fellow advocates, the handful of survivors from the mine who still lived in Denver. Marcus Webb came from Wyoming, older now, but still carrying that intensity in his eyes. The minister who spoke offered conventional words about a life well lived in service to community, but afterward, standing in the cemetery as workers filled the grave, Marcus said something that felt truer. He showed us that one person could matter. The newspaper obituary was brief and factual, noting his work as a claims adjuster and his role in exposing the Carver mine operation. It did not capture the complexity of the man or the quiet persistence that had defined his later years. But then, newspapers rarely did. They dealt in headlines and certainties, while lives were made of doubts and compromises and small acts of resistance that accumulated slowly into something larger. The nameless town continued its decline. By 1910, only one family remained, caring for the cemetery where a handful of graves marked those who had died before the Exodus. By 1920, even they had gone, and the valley returned to wilderness. Timber buildings collapsed under snow and wind. The main street disappeared beneath encroaching grass and sage. The mine entrance, sealed by territorial order, became just another shadow on the hillside. For decades, the site existed in that peculiar space between history and legend. Old-timers in surrounding towns would mention it occasionally, usually in the context of warning young people about the dangers of lawlessness or the importance of standing up to tyranny. But the details blurred with each retelling, and by the 1950s, most people who heard the story assumed it was an exaggeration, a morality tale dressed up as fact. Then Sarah Chen found that letter in 2019, and the careful work of excavation and documentation began. Standing in the chamber where men had been chained, where Daniel Corot had filed away at his bonds through 17 nights of desperate determination, she felt the weight of nearly forgotten history pressing against the present. The chains were real. The carved message was real. The suffering that had occurred here was not legend but documented fact. She thought about all the stories that might be hidden in other valleys, other abandoned sites, waiting for someone to care enough to look. She thought about the systems that allowed such places to exist, and how some of those systems persisted in different forms, adapted to new times but still capable of turning human beings into commodities when conditions allowed. The archaeological work took 2 seasons to complete. Sarah's team documented everything meticulously, knowing that their findings would be scrutinized and challenged. They found fragments of tools, remnants of the chains, marks on the stone walls where picks had struck day after day. They found evidence of at least 23 individuals who had been held in the chamber, though they could not determine how many had survived and how many had died there. The site was officially designated a historical landmark in 2021. A small museum was established in the nearest town, housing artifacts and documents related to the case. Visitors could walk a trail to the sealed mine entrance, where an information panel explained what had occurred. School groups came for field trips. Historians used it as a case study in labor practices and the evolution of mining regulations. But Sarah understood that preservation was only part of the work. The other part was ensuring that people understood why it mattered, not just as history, but as a continuing conversation about justice, power, and the choices individuals make when confronted with wrongdoing. She gave talks at universities and historical societies, always emphasizing the same points: that Daniel Carew had been an ordinary man with failures and flaws, that he had not arrived in the valley as a hero, but had become one through a series of difficult choices. That the townspeople who finally stood with him had been paralyzed by fear for years before finding their courage. That the system designed to prevent such abuses had failed repeatedly, and might fail again if people became complacent. And she always ended with the same question: what would you have done if you had been Carew, offered money to look away, if you had been a townsperson, watching injustice but fearing for your family, if you had been a worker in the mine, chained in darkness? Not to judge, she emphasized, but to understand that ethical choices are rarely simple, that context matters, that courage is hard. In the spring of 2023, nearly 135 years after Carew first arrived in the nameless town, Sarah organized a commemoration ceremony at the site. Descendants of survivors attended, as did representatives from labor organizations and historical societies. They stood on ground where buildings had once lined a street, where people had walked in silence, where a town had finally found its voice. A descendant of Marcus Webb spoke about his great-grandfather's life, how the boy who had warned Carew to leave had instead become a man who spent his life ensuring others would not face the same choice between silence and danger. A professor of labor history discussed the reforms that had emerged from the case, the slow progress of regulations designed to protect workers. And Sarah read from Carew's final report, the one that had been misfiled and forgotten for so long, his description of standing in the chamber and realizing he could not walk away. As the ceremony concluded, a young journalist approached Sarah. She was working on a story about historical sites and their relevance to contemporary issues, and she wanted to know what Sarah thought people should take from the Carver mine case. Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking at the valley around them. The pine-covered slopes, the sky so blue it seemed impossible that darkness had ever existed here. What happened here wasn't extraordinary evil. That's what makes it important. It was ordinary people making choices, some to exploit, some to enable through silence, and eventually some to resist. The mine is sealed now, the town is gone, and everyone involved has been dead for decades. But those choices remain relevant. We still face them in different forms. The sun moved across the valley as visitors slowly departed, driving back toward highways and cities, carrying the story with them. By evening, the site was empty again, just wilderness and memory, the way it had been for so long before Sarah Chen opened that archive box and found a forgotten letter. But something had changed, subtly but significantly. The silence that had once covered this place like snow was broken now. The truth had been spoken, documented, preserved. And in towns and cities across the country, people who heard the story would carry it forward. Another small light against the darkness that always waited for good people to look away. The valley held its secrets still. There were surely other stories buried in the earth, other voices that had been silenced and not yet recovered, but this one, at least, had been brought into the light. Daniel Careau's decision to resist rather than compromise, to accept chains rather than complicity, had echoed across more than a century to find someone willing to listen. And that, Sarah thought as she stood alone at the site after everyone had left, that was as close to justice as history ever came. Not perfect, not complete, but real, a accounting, an acknowledgement, a choice to remember rather than forget. The sun set behind the western ridge, casting long shadows across the valley. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, its voice carrying across the empty space where a town had stood. And in the growing dark, the land settled into itself, patient and enduring, holding both the weight of what had happened and the possibility that someone, someday, would care enough to ask why.